I'm Ellen Umansky, the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies at Fairfield University and founding director of its Bennett Center for Judaic Studies, now in its 27th year. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 9th Samuel and Betty Roberts Lecture in Jewish Art, a biennial lecture series made possible through a generous endowment from Larry Roberts and Suzanne Novick. This endowment to the Bennett Center was made in memory of Larry and Suzanne's parents, both of whom were supporters of the Bennett Center and devoted to the arts. Betty as an extremely talented professional painter, Sam as a skilled photographer, which he pursued as an avocation. The endowment has helped fund not just this evening's lecture, but financial resources to purchase books and films on Jewish art for the university's Domena Nicilius Library, and also to fund the undergraduate art history course taught every other year by my colleague, Dr. Philip Eliasov, entitled Jewish Art, Moses to Modernity. This course is being taught this semester, and in fact, our speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment, did a terrific job speaking to the class this morning. It is my great pleasure to welcome to Fairfield University, albeit virtually, Irvin Ungar, a former pulpit rabbi and antiquarian bookseller, specializing in historic Judaica. He has devoted the past 30 years to scholarship on illustrator and activist Arthur Szyk, who was renowned during the first half of the 20th century for his prolific illustrations in books, newspapers, and magazines. Largely responsible for the resurgence and interest of Szyk and his art, Irvin Ungar, whom I've known for many, many years, and whose work I've long admired, has curated and consulted for numerous Szyk exhibitions, including the Fine Arts Museum in San Francisco, the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., the Library of Congress, and the New York Historical Society. He is the author of Arthur Szyk, Soldier in Art, winner of the 2017 National Jewish Book Award. He is co-producer of the documentary film, Soldier in Art, Arthur Szyk, and is the curator and publisher of the luxury limited edition of the Szyk Haggadah. He has also served as the curator of the Arthur Szyk Society in Burlingame, California. Tonight, Irvin will share with us images from and insights on Szyk's famous Haggadah, still widely distributed in Israel and the United States. For those joining us tonight who may not know, the Haggadah is the book used by Jews during the ritual meal, or Seder, held during Passover, which recounts and relives the story of the Israelites' slavery in Egypt, their being freed by God, and their going to Mount Sinai under the leadership of Moses to receive God's commandments. In light of the fact that Passover is just over a month away, I thought that Szyk's Haggadah would be a wonderful focus for this evening's lecture. Again, my deepest thanks to Larry Roberts and Suzanne Novick for making this evening and our biennial lecture series in Jewish art possible, and for choosing to honor their parents, whom I still remember fondly in this way. My thanks as well to Jennifer Hanos, Program Manager of the Bennett Center for Judaic Studies, for her hard work in coordinating the many facets of this evening. My thanks as well to Anthony Santora in the university's Media Center for his able tech support, and my thanks to Dr. Philip Eliasov, Professor of Visual and Performing Arts, for welcoming Irvin Ungar into his Jewish art class today, and for sharing the virtual stage with me tonight following the Roberts Lecture, as we ask Irvin a few questions to kick off what I hope will be an engaging and insightful question and answer period. For those of you who have a question you'd like to ask our speaker, please write your questions in the Q&A function. You can do so at any time during the lecture, and I'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And now, please join me in welcoming to this virtual platform to deliver the 2021 Samuel and Betty Roberts Lecture in Jewish Art, Irvin Ungar.
Ellen, thank you so much for your gracious introduction. And I am truly delighted and honored to speak to the Fairfield University student body, to the faculty, to your community, and to those listeners across the United States and abroad. I must say that it is my objective this evening to attempt to inspire you, to the listeners, to want to know more about the art and messages of Arthur Szyk and the man himself. And now to the Arthur Szyk and the art of the Haggadah. This introductory vignette before you of European Jews clustered in chains, together with the pyramids of ancient Egypt, provides a window into the artist's moving of history and transporting of place and time. This image demonstrates how Szyk uses a traditional text, in this case, the ancient Haggadah narrative, to provide a visual commentary on contemporary events which he partially witnessed and fully envisioned in 1930s Poland and Europe on the eve of the Holocaust. Welcome into the art and worldview of the Haggadah of Arthur Szyk. This presentation will focus on the specific themes emphasized by Szyk within the context of the Haggadah, drawing particular attention to his activist nature and his call for a response by his Jewish brothers and sisters to the tragedy unfolding before them in Nazi-occupied Europe, and to a unprepared world virtually silent to their plight. The Haggadah tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Who brought the Israelites out? Not Moses. How they were brought out? Not by Moses. And why they were brought out. The Exodus is the seminal event in Jewish history and remembered in daily ritual prayers, and every Friday evening when Jews chant the Kiddush, the prayer over wine, and recite the Hebrew words Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim as a reminder of the Exodus and freedom from Egypt. And why do Jews need to routinely remind themselves of freedom? Why do all of us, Jew and non-Jew, need to be summoned? Because that right is not a given. It must constantly be protected and safeguarded. One must be vigilant in its defense. And this is Arthur Szyk. Passover is that great story of freedom from degradation and shame, from bondage and oppression. And it is the obligation of every Jew to tell that story to the next generation. And that story can be told with either a Maxwell House Haggadah or the Szyk Haggadah, or the more than 5,000 editions in between. I would like to think that Arthur Szyk's Haggadah, as will become apparent, rises to the very heights of capturing the essence of the Jewish past, the story of its then tragic present, and the need to be rigorously diligent to physically ensure a Jewish future. So the question is, who is Arthur Szyk? And there are 3 dates to keep in mind. He was born in Lodz, Poland in 1894 to an upper middle class textile manufacturing family. In 1940, he went on to become America's leading anti-Nazi artist during World War II, Hitler having placed a price tag on his head, declaring him a dangerous enemy of Germany. And the 3rd date is he died in New Canaan, Connecticut in 1951. Szyk loved 3 countries during his lifetime: Poland, the land of his birth; Israel, the land of his people; and America, the land of his ideals. His illumination of the proclamation of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, when he also became an American citizen, and his illumination of the Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1950 hung side by side in his New Canaan home. His Declaration of Independence now resides at the Library of Congress. And now, to the context of the creation of Szyk's Haggadah. In 1933, Hitler came to power. The government of the United States decided to invite one Jew from Europe to come to America for the purpose of exhibiting his artworks on freedom at the Library of Congress. On a cold December 1933 day, Arthur Szyk and his wife Julia arrived in New York City in 1933 for an exhibition of his art, which was an exhibition of his art was already taking place at the Brooklyn Museum. And two bodies of work were featured in this exhibition: Washington and His Times, 38 paintings which highlighted America's fight for freedom during the Revolutionary War, paintings which eventually hung in the White House. And also exhibited was his Statutes of Polish, 45 paintings which advocated for the freedom of Jews in Poland beginning in the 13th century and called for mutual and beneficial cooperation between Jews and Poles in late 1920s and early 1930s Poland. In 1934, an exhibition of these works on freedom moved to the Library of Congress. And in recognition of these exhibitions and Szyk's advocacy for freedom on behalf of humanity, he was presented the George Washington Bicentennial Medal by the United States Congress. This already after he had been decorated by the French government with the Palme Académique in 1923 and the Gold Cross of Merit by Poland in 1931, the highest award honoring Polish citizens. These awards for his works in the service of humanity. With his third medal in hand, after 7 months in the US, Szyk returned to Europe and his hometown of Lodz and began to illustrate that great book of freedom in Jewish tradition, the Haggadah. And between 1934 and 1936, he illuminated 48 manuscript leaves, including the calligraphy, miniature watercolor and gouache paintings on paper. Now, please keep in mind that Germany's racist Nuremberg laws of 1935 were instituted right in the middle of Szyk's working on the Haggadah. In 1937, armed with the portfolio of his response to the Nazi threat to his people and the retelling and contemporizing of an ancient narrative, he carried those leaves with him to London, where over the next 3 years, he would supervise the printing of the Haggadah. And during this time, his anti-fascist caricatures and cartoons attacking the Nazis also appeared in British magazines and newspapers. Just one of them from the 1930s, this piece here shows Hitler standing atop the Reichstag with an olive branch in one hand and the Nazi salute in the other. "Never trust a wolf in sheep's clothing" might be its caption. Szyk used to say, "Never trust a wolf that promises to be a vegetarian." Back to the Haggadah. While working on the Haggadah, Szyk would write to his editor, Cecil Roth, in 1938. Remember, he came to London in 1937 for its printing. And in 38, he wrote, "The Haggadah is the work of my life. I have sacrificed many years of my work, as well as all of my fortune, which has been very small during the war, in order to complete it. I have even contracted debts to finish it." In 1940, almost overshadowed by the falling bombs on London during the Battle of Britain, Szyk's Haggadah was published on the finest of vellum skins in an edition of 250 copies in an elegant binding by the prestigious bookbinder Sangorski and Sutcliffe. The renowned Cecil Roth declared, "To call Arthur Szyk the greatest illuminator since the 16th century is no flattery. It is the simple truth that manifests itself to anyone who studies his work with the care which it deserves." Similarly, the Times of London compared Szyk's Haggadah to the masterpieces of the Middle Ages, stating that it is worthy to be placed among the most beautiful of books that the hand of man has produced. And at $500 per copy, it was the most expensive new book in the entire world. The publisher was the Beaconsfield Press, a cooperative consisting of Jews from Lvov, who together with a few wealthy British Jews put up the money to publish only one book, the Haggadah. They called it the Beaconsfield Press, hoping they might capitalize on the name of the Earl of Beaconsfield, Benjamin Disraeli, a born Jew, Queen Victoria's man of the people, who was twice Prime Minister of Great Britain. In 1956, 5 years after Szyk died, the first popular trade edition of his Haggadah was published in Israel. 10,000 copies were printed in 1956. 10,000 copies were printed in 1957, continuing in the 1960s, 80s, 90s, and through the year 2000. In 2008, I published a new edition of the Szyk Haggadah in Premier and Deluxe editions with a new translation and commentary by Rabbi Byron Sherwin, a prominent scholar from Chicago affiliated with the Spertus Institute. And I followed this by creating a popular trade edition in softcover, which Abrams Books of New York published in 2011. With the history of the creation of the Szyk Haggadah now summarized, I would like now to turn to the art itself and to start by explicating and decoding one Haggadah page, which will help us understand how Szyk used his art to call world attention to the plight of his fellow Jews. This work, in fact, before you, is the introductory dedication page for the Haggadah itself. But first, a question. By a show of hands, which I cannot see, how many of you saw the movie of the King's Speech about a decade ago, starring Colin Firth? It is to this very king, George VI, to whom Szyk dedicated his Haggadah, and who ascended the throne in December of 1936, when Szyk finished all of the original Haggadah artwork. The Hebrew text, illuminated text reads, "At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing forth the afflictions of my people Israel." Arthur Szyk, Illuminator of Poland. Why did Szyk decide to dedicate the great book of freedom to the newly proclaimed British monarch in 1936? He had two reasons. First, because he planned to leave Poland at the end of 1936 for England to supervise the printing of the book. So it made perfect sense, political sense, to dedicate it to the new king. But second, and more important, Szyk saw Great Britain as the leading opponent of Nazism. Remember, America would not be in the war for 5 more years. And by dedicating a book recalling the Jews' biblical liberation from tyranny to King George VI, and then presenting the first printed copy of the Haggadah to him, Szyk placed upon the king the responsibility to recognize the injustices done to the Jewish people in the past while awakening him to their present tragedy. But there was a problem with dedicating the Haggadah to the British king. After World War I, the League of Nations had granted Britain a mandate over the territories of the Ottoman Empire that included Palestine. And by 1936, the British government had already enacted its first in a series of white papers, designated to restrict the flow of European Jews to their biblical homeland. Knowing this, how could Szyk dedicate this book celebrating freedom to the head of a government that restricted the freedom of his people, that would keep them virtually trapped in Europe with no way to escape the grasp of the Nazi vulture in Palestine? How could he be both intellectually and emotionally honest in confronting this dilemma as an artist for freedom? And herein lies the genius of Arthur Szyk. At the bottom right of the dedication page, he has painted a modern exodus of European Jews in transit to the gates of Palestine, which is seen on the bottom left and inscribed in Hebrew with the word Zion or Zion. And between the Jews who wished to exit Europe and entering the land of Israel, in the very center stands a British military ship, which is blocking their flight to freedom. The Haggadah is a religious text, but for Arthur Szyk, it was a political book about justice and freedom. His visual narrative speaks truth to power and presents a compelling call to action. And as if to emphasize who had boldly dared to put forth this call, Szyk painted his own portrait on the dedication page. We see him standing by his people, palette in hand, a soldier in art, dressed in quasi-military garb, fighting on their behalf, an illuminator of Poland. Again, the first copy was presented to the king. I shall now point out the themes which Szyk emphasizes in his Haggadah, after which I will then turn to the individual images which support those themes. First and foremost, it is clear that Szyk sees the Nazis as the new Egyptians who have come to annihilate his people. Secondly, he emphasizes that the response of his people must be heroism, not victimhood. And thirdly, Szyk clearly calls attention to hatred and anti-Semitism of varying kinds directed against the Jewish people throughout history, and unequivocally and militantly advocates for destruction of the eternal enemy of the people of Israel, namely the blotting out of the biblical Amalek and its evil descendants. Fourth, Szyk emphasizes the role of Moses and David in the Haggadah. Fifth, Szyk places strong attention on Zionist motifs. Sixth, his portrayal of the four sons is entirely unique, not only within the Haggadah, but within the whole of Jewish art, and his parable that derives from it, following the war, is equally poignant and powerful. And finally, attention will be paid to the 5 dedication pages which Szyk completed for the Haggadah, only 2 of which were included in the 1940 publication. And now to the multitude of images and the first of Szyk's themes: Hitler as the new Pharaoh and the Nazis as the new Egyptians. Szyk began attacking Hitler in his art as early as 1933, during his early commuting days between Poland and London. Here one sees Hitler as Pharaoh and his attendant Hermann Göring, who oversaw the creation of the Gestapo and was one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi Party. Both are dressed in Egyptian garb. This image did not appear in the Haggadah, nor was it drawn for it. It was merely a sketch, never completed, but it is proof of how Szyk saw the intent of the Nazi leader as a ruler who was bent upon the destruction of the people of Israel, and how he associated him with the Passover narrative. Avadim hayinu. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Here we see an Egyptian taskmaster in the upper right corner with Aryan blonde hair and blue eyes, forcing Hebrew slaves who are wearing yarmulkes, head coverings, to chisel away and paint Egyptian gods, an ultimate act of humiliation. While in the vignette below, Pharaoh sits on his throne as part of the completion of the story of We Were Slaves. I wish to call to your attention the circular yellow and round and red rondel in the center of the chest of the Egyptian, again in the upper right. It was here and elsewhere in his Haggadah that Szyk painted swastikas as a means of identifying the new taskmasters as Nazis. Those same rondels appear on the arms and chests of other Egyptians as well. But he painted over them prior to publication. In the printed Haggadah, as on the original artwork shown here, the swastikas are nowhere to be seen, likely as a result of the publisher's censorship and persuasion of Szyk to remove them, lest the Haggadah might never see the light of day because of, as shall I say, political correctness of the day. I can only imagine how Szyk must have felt. But how do we know that there were swastikas there in the first place? In 2002, in preparation for the Szyk exhibition, The Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I suggested to the museum to look for swastikas on several of the Haggadah pieces which were loaned. We Were Slaves was one of the pieces. How did I know to tell them? Because several years before, I met a man in his late 70s, a Mr. Horowitz, in Tel Aviv, who told me that when he was a little boy in Lvov, Szyk visited his father's home in 1936 to show the senior Horowitz, a sponsor of the Haggadah's publication later in London, to show him the Haggadah art that Szyk had completed. Young Horowitz came down the steps, he told me. Late that night, men were gathered around the dining room table examining Szyk's Haggadah art, and squeezing between them, he saw swastikas on the Egyptians, on the snakes, and on the arm of the wicked son in the Haggadah. All, again, were eventually painted over or removed. But prior to the museum opening, through special magnification and with equipment able to see beneath layers of paint, the swastikas were indeed there. Mr. Horowitz was right, and I hope you can see faintly the swastika under the layers of paint within the circular rondel on the right. Concentrate, you'll see it. And so too, swastikas appeared initially on this most beautiful of Haggadah images, the four questions. While the father or grandfather listens to the son or grandson read from the Haggadah in the large initial mem, which is the upper right large quadrant of the Hebrew word ma, of ma nishtana. Why is this night different from all the other nights, which is the Hebrew text here, which, by the way, is, we might ask, why is this Passover different from all other Passovers? We see within the mem smallish vignettes. In the bottom of this large mem, small, we can see the Egyptians drowning in the sea. In the upper left, we see baby Moses, and to the right, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. But above them, in the upper right corner, lurks the serpent, ready to attack the earliest freedom marchers, and on the snake's back are indeed swastikas, as can be seen on this recently discovered lithograph produced in 1935, which shows the swastikas on the serpent before they were painted over on the original art prior to the 1940 publication. Indeed, Mr. Horowitz was right again. And here are Szyk's four sons, the wise, wicked, simple, and the one who does not know how to ask. Four adult men, four types of people. But for the rabbis and for Szyk, these were clearly four Jews. It is the wicked son in the upper left upon whom I wish to focus. In most all illustrated Haggadot prior to the 20th century, the wicked son was primarily portrayed as a soldier, an enemy of the Jewish people, his outward appearance and actions evidencing hatred. In Szyk's case, a wicked son is seen as a Jew clothed in the garb of self-hatred, a German Jew as opposed to Polish Jews, with riding boots, a crop, a feathered hat, a cigarette, and a Hitler-like mustache. On this wicked son, Szyk had once painted a swastika, probably as an armband. But this is the image we have in the Haggadah. How do we know that a swastika was once there? The clue here again comes from the original art itself, where we see the verso of the paper on which Szyk painted the four sons, the back of the paper left over for one of his earlier projects. And in the upper right-hand corner, that quadrant, which has remnants of tape around it, was cut out, and the first wicked son was replaced with the one that we see now. And if we flip over the sheet, we can see, if we flip it from right to left, we can see that that quadrant with remnants of the old tape and new would indeed be the portion upon which the original wicked son was once painted. And again, Mr. Horowitz was right for the third time. The question remains, how could Szyk paint a swastika on a fellow Jew and call a fellow Jew a Nazi, particularly at a time when Hitler was in power? The fact was that when Szyk painted this image in 1934, there were Jews who supported the National Socialists and their economic policies. And to Arthur Szyk, they would have been as if they too were Nazis. Ancient Jewish warriors. Szyk's second theme emphasized in his Haggadah is response, heroism, not victimhood, symbolized by the numerous Jewish fighters and warriors. We see them in the dedication page to King George, a helmeted soldier with a 7-branched menorah atop. We see them in a warrior associated with the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in Egypt. We see them in the first battle with Amalek, a wilderness people with whom the Israelites fought after crossing through the Sea of Reeds, Israel's first enemy on its path to freedom. We see them in the great Hallel, a psalm of praise, Szyk's hero, a warrior, and in the context of the song of Echad Miyodea, who knows one. And we see these warriors, we see these fighters, we see these soldiers, we see the young King David here in Haggadah and Dayenu, twice with the head of Goliath. And note that on the left, Goliath has blonde hair and blue eyes, Szyk portraying him as an Aryan to be dealt with. What does David have to do with the Haggadah and the Passover narrative? Absolutely nothing. But for Arthur Szyk, everything, as he represents heroism and the need to stand up to the powerful enemy. It was images such as this with which Szyk hoped to inspire and uplift his people in mid to late 1930s Europe. And two last and unlikely presentation of heroic figures. First, the prophet Elijah. Here we see the beautiful cup of Elijah, but Szyk departs from emphasizing the ceremonial traditional visit by Elijah to every Jewish Passover Seder meal and his bringing of blessings, and instead he chooses to call attention to Elijah's heroic act of confronting and rebuking the evil king Ahab on Mount Carmel. And here, the prophet Samuel puts Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to death before the Lord at Gilgal. We transition here from the heroes of ancient Israel, as Szyk sees them, to the eternal enemies of the Jewish people, embodied by Amalek. To do so, it is essential first to highlight Szyk's illumination of the Haggadah text. In every generation, they stand against us to annihilate us. B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lechalotenu. Many of the various nations throughout history who attempted to annihilate the Jewish people are pictured here within this single image by Szyk. The Assyrian king in the lower left is represented by a mask, the wheel of the Roman chariot toward the bottom right, a Roman eagle standard, which is enlarged in the detail, bearing the famous Latin inscription SPQR Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people, the medieval shield, yellow and red, with the emblems of the Spanish kings of Castile and Leon, representing the Spanish Inquisition, the pinkish helmet bearing the word Haman, just below, signifying the biblical story of Esther and Mordecai's triumph over Haman's plot to destroy the Jews during the holiday of Purim, which is celebrated tomorrow evening. The imperial double-headed eagle toward the top right, not quite to the top, of Tsarist Russia, recalling the pogroms, the cannons, top right, as symbols of a particular war or all wars. All while the Jew has survived these acts of genocide and can raise the cup in celebration of life, as we see in the upper left. This scene brings to mind the words of Mark Twain, who in his short 1899 essay concerning the Jews for Harper's Magazine wrote, and I quote, "The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in the twilight now or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" Perhaps, Mr. Twain, Szyk's response might be, it is in the Jew's stubborn attempt and insistence to adhere to God's moral law and its intellectual challenge, as represented by the 10 Commandments, which preside over this image, that offer a clue to their survival. And now to Amalek, the eternal enemy of Israel. The teacher instructs his students, "You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heaven. Do not forget." And on the bottom of Elijah's cup, "You shall blot out the memory of Amalek." And in the bottom center, the Lord will be at war with Amalek in every generation. And here, in modern Moses, a work of art distributed by the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, for which Szyk served as one of its vice presidents, Aaron, a man of peace, on the left, is replaced by a Jewish soldier, and Hur, the nephew warrior of Moses, is replaced by a resistance fighter to fight the modern Amalek of 1940s Europe. And now, Szyk's emphasis on the scales of justice. A leading nation is Amalek, and its fate is to perish forever, as we turn to the theme of the scales of justice. Amalek will be judged as evidenced by the scales which are shown here, as well as will King Belshazzar be judged, who desecrated the vessels in the Holy Temple according to the biblical book of Daniel, the Hebrew writing on the wall indicating that he will die. Scales of justice, again, here within the Star of David. And here, Judith meted out punishment to the invading Assyrian general Holofernes, killing him with his own sword, again justice, as symbolized by the scale. And again, an enemy of ancient Israel is identified by Szyk with a swastika on the pommel of the sword, hopefully visible on part of the lion's tail to the far right in the center. Moving now to David and Moses. For Szyk's Haggadah, justice and retribution will ultimately prevail. He sees Jewish militancy and activism, of which David and Moses are paradigmatic models, as the primary vehicles for meting out justice to the foes of the people of Israel. 3 versions of Moses strikes the Egyptian appear here. The far right image appeared in the Haggadah. The center image was painted in 1933 before Szyk began formally working in 1934 on the Haggadah. The far left painting was done in Paris in the mid-1920s, when Szyk began to illustrate his first Haggadah, which was never published and abandoned at the end of the 1920s. We return to this image again, which was shown earlier, but I want to emphasize here Moses standing before Pharaoh in the bottom vignette. But there's a problem with this image. Surely Szyk knows that in the biblical narrative, it was not Moses who stood before the Egyptian ruler, but it was Aaron. And how do we know in the first place that it's Moses here putting forth the rod and not Aaron? Because Aaron, the high priest, wears the breastplate of the 12 tribes and stands to the right. So why then does Szyk paint Moses in this fashion, front and center before Pharaoh? And the answer is because he wants to elevate the status of Moses to the Haggadah reader. And here we see 3 Exodus images. The far right painting appearing in the Haggadah, the center image painted in 1933, the image on the far left painted in the 1920s. This earliest image on the far left does not have Moses presiding over the Exodus as he does in the top left on the 2 images on the right. And again, Moses stands atop in the upper left as the enemies of Israel perish. And this final slide of Moses. We return to this image once again, but here I want to focus on Moses with a bare chest covered by his white beard, as if he was a bodybuilder, as if he had trained under the once popular fitness guru, Jack LaLanne. He's shown here as a military leader with his arms raised. The Israelites, and when they are raised, the Israelites are victorious in battle. Szyk has clearly chosen, as we have seen throughout the Haggadah, to emphasize that men and women, such as Judith, must become involved in the physical redemption of their brothers and sisters. And where the rabbis removed Moses from the Haggadah and placed redemption totally in God's hands, Szyk chose to reinstate Moses in the Passover narrative. Because the Bible mentions Moses, but the Haggadah does not. Szyk puts him back. But rather than emphasize Moses' role as a religious leader, Szyk portrays him first and foremost as a military figure who is to be emulated by the Jews of Europe. And now to David in the Haggadah. 2 images of young David, which I've shown previously. And here, an elegant King David is shown in the Haggadah tailpiece, the very last piece, almost the very last piece of the Haggadah. Below David are words, recited as one completes the reading of one of the 5 books of Moses in the Torah scroll at the synagogue. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong, and may you be strengthened. Szyk chooses the words from Psalms 53:7 to inscribe on the tablet held by David. Oh, that the deliverance of Israel might come from Zion. When the Lord restores the fortune of his people, Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad. This in 1936. And what is wrong with this image? It should be the Egyptians in the chariot chasing the Israelites, but rather it is the Hebrews in the chariot running down their enemies. The enemy you can see is under the 3 horses on the bottom left. How so is it that these are the Hebrews in the chariot? Notice the Star of David that is on the chariot that is just above the wheel, and the blue and white banner. Both are symbols of the Jewish people. The eagle of Rome or Nazi Germany hovers over the fallen enemy on the left, while the dove of peace is associated with King David, author of the psalm in Hebrew at the very bottom that accompanies this image. Szyk again moves history, like my initial slide, when it had the European Jews with the ancient pyramids, Szyk again moves history in a way to emphasize the pride, ultimately here in this image, the pride of victory for his people, driven by its heroic leaders. And now to Zionism motifs throughout the Haggadah. The word Zion, Zion, representing the land of Israel, first appears on this page in the bottom left. And here, an elderly man blesses his family as they head off as pioneers to the land of Israel. This Szyk advocating in 1935. Szyk encouraging Jews to leave Europe for Zion, for Palestine. Matzah is both the bread of affliction and the bread of freedom. It has dual meaning. And how does Szyk illuminate that idea? In this page, this is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in Egypt. In the bottom left, we see two Israelites who are in chains, working for the Egyptian taskmasters, symbolizing affliction. And on the bottom right, two Jews are going off to the land of Israel as free men to be their own taskmasters and to emphasize their character as the new Jew who will pioneer and secure the land. Szyk paints a tattoo, a Star of David, on the forearm of one of the two secular Jewish workers on the bottom right, who will carry off a macho spirit to the new land. All of this in the 1930s. In contrast here, a religious Jew sows the land. And to conclude the Zionist motifs, again, the blue and white banner, which were to become the colors of the Israeli flag. And now to the four sons. One final look at Szyk's four sons, painted twice in the Haggadah, but with a focus this time at a parable that derives from them. Much like today, where there are different attitudes among American Jews toward the state of Israel, as the war ended in 1945, Szyk illustrated the different opinions toward the creation of a Jewish state through the parable of the four sons. Serving as the vice chairman of Peter Bergson's American League for a Free Palestine, Szyk strongly advocated for Jewish statehood. All of these American Jews are pictured here have a distinctly different disposition. The wicked son asks, in 1945, the wicked Jew asks, what is this nonsense about a Hebrew nation and an independent homeland? When all this fuss blows over, when a war is well behind, let them, the survivors, return to the countries they came from. The democracies will see to it that they are safe again and free to worship as other people are everywhere. The indifferent and uninformed sons need to be educated about the meaning of the land of Israel to the Jewish people, and that this land is precisely the haven that European Jews require despite the restrictions imposed by its British overlords. The wise son, a helmeted GI, asks, as a free citizen of the United States, sworn to support the principles of freedom and democracy through peace and in a succession of wars from 1776 to this very day, I want to know how I can help my fellow men and women of Europe and Palestine to survive and be free. How can I help to stamp out this ceaseless persecution and banish for good the hideous specter of anti-Semitism? These questions and others were already at the forefront of Arthur Szyk's mind on the eve of the printing of his Haggadah. And finally, the dedication pages. We have fully explored this dedication page to the British King, except for one important note. Szyk had added 3 additional words to this dedication. And what were the 3 words? Unaddressed and unavenged. Words which were removed prior to the Haggadah's printing. Szyk again self-censoring himself by painting over them with the 3 horizontal decorative bars which are below the text. Now, whether Szyk was under pressure from his editor or the publisher, we will never know. These words initially appeared at the bottom of his dedication, which would have originally read, "At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing forth the afflictions of my people Israel, unaddressed and unavenged." 2 other dedication pages. The dedication to the Jews of Germany and Austria was created by Szyk after the Anschluss and the annexation of Austria, and Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, both in 1938. The Hebrew text reads, "This Haggadah is presented to our brothers, the Jewish people of Germany and Austria, who were persecuted because of their race and their faith, and who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name." These words, like those of the previous dedication to George VI, were Szyk's words. And similarly, in the dedication to the Jews of Germany in September 1939, shortly after the war broke out that month, Szyk began this dedication page. "To the memory of my brethren in Germany in the 57th century, I'm dedicating these pictures." The 57th century refers to the Jewish calendar year of 5700, which began on September 14th, 1939, almost 1 year after Kristallnacht and 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland. Both of these dedications were never included in the printed Haggadah. Szyk created the following dedication as well, and like 2 of the previous 3 dedications, his self-portrait also appears here. The Polish and Yiddish texts read, "Wanting to pay tribute to my ancestral homeland, the residence of my forefathers, I dedicate with great devotion and affection this particular Haggadah, and in work of the notables of the city of Lemberg, who were stimulated by my work, I am calling this book the Lemberger Haggadah," the German name for Lvov, now also Lviv. Szyk remained forever devoted to his country of birth and the Jews, like Mr. Horowitz, who supported his work there. This dedication page did not appear in the 1940 printed edition, with the exception of 1 known copy. And 1 last dedication page of my last theme. This one appearing at the end of the Haggadah. And with this text, Szyk concludes his Haggadah in French, where he says, "I am but a Jew, praying in art. If I have succeeded in any measure, if I have gained the power of reception among the elite of the world, I owe it all to the teachings, to the traditions, and to the eternal virtues of my people Israel." And he signed this piece, "Image d'Israël, Arthur Szyk, painter of Israel," in contrast to the beginning dedication to George VI, where he signed it Illuminator of Poland. My final slide presents side by side the first page of Szyk's Haggadah with the last page of his Haggadah. His frontispiece on the left alongside the French dedication page. And why do I do this? Because I wish to emphasize that very element which pervaded Szyk's Haggadah from beginning to end and demonstrated his great love for the Jewish people and its eternal physical and spiritual capital of Jerusalem. If we look at the frontispiece on the left, at the very top, pointed to by the red arrow, and this is the very top of the first leaf and the very first sentence in his Haggadah, we see in Hebrew the words of the psalmist, "Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini," "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither." And if we look then at the last leaf of his Haggadah and the very last sentence, again, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Szyk, the artist, whose Haggadah was the work of his life, could not live without his right hand. Szyk, the man, could not live without Jerusalem and the love of his people at the heart of his soul. And to illustrate this very last point, just a bit further, I would like to conclude my presentation with a short story about a man in a long black coat. In February of 2009, I traveled to Israel to exhibit and showcase my then recently published limited edition Szyk Haggadah at the Jerusalem International Book Fair. Essentially, I went to Israel to introduce a whole new generation of Israelis to Szyk through his Haggadah. And while there at this crowded book fair, a man in a long black coat with the blackest black hat and the fullest black beard walked up to the glass showcase in front of my booth, which was featuring the Szyk Haggadah. And he said to me in perfect English, "This is the Haggadah of Arthur Szyk, correct?" And he was from an anti-Zionist Hasidic sect, Toldos Aharon. I was astonished that not only that he spoke to me, and that he spoke to me without a Yiddish accent, but that he recognized the Haggadah. And then he stepped closer and he asked, "May I tell you something?" "Yes, of course," I replied. "I know that Arthur Szyk was not a religious man, but," and he paused, "every time I look at the Hebrew calligraphy in Szyk's Haggadah, I know that he was a man with a deep Jewish soul." It was worth my trip to Jerusalem just to hear this one line from one such anonymous religious man, and to know that Szyk's essence, that his heart and his soul, his hand and his art have the power not only to touch one man so very different from him, but to touch so many different kinds of souls throughout the ages. Thank you very much.
Irv, that was just a magnificent presentation. Thank you so much. I'm now going to ask my colleague, Dr. Philip Eliasov, to join us.
All right. Hello. Yes. Thank you, Ellen. What a marvelous invitation to such a wonderful contribution to American art and to the understanding of Jewish art and culture. I have the greatest admiration for the work, the 30 years. It takes passion, scholarship, skill, maybe some good luck, Irvin, to do what you've achieved. It's monumental. And may Arthur Szyk's memory live gloriously because of the work, Irvin, you've done. Let me make this comment. I've admired, as you know, and I've shared with Ellen, I've admired Szyk's work for most of my life as an art history professor. And it dawned on me when you were going through the Haggadah and you were doing this interpretation and literally visually translating, going from the verbal to the visual to the vowels of the Haggadah and the Dayenu, the turning of the forms and shapes into a Hebrew calligraphy and letters, a kind of very fluid. It took someone with a rabbinic background, Irvin Ungar, to make this full, complete translation. Even art history scholars and critics who have admired the work of Szyk since the 1930s. Cecil Roth understood his brilliance. Art scholars have always said he was among the world's finest caricature editorial artist appearing in print all over the world in many languages. But your insight to it, Irvin, allowed us to move very fluidly from the script and the Hebrew from my bad bar mitzvah training Hebrew. You made it all come alive. So for there, that's something that only your. Now I'll go to a second. The first time we spoke on the phone, we had a little conversation, and I said, how would you characterize the language, the lexicon of art history? As we talk about, we use style language. It's style driven, how is it? So how would you characterize stylistically, if you had to say the work of Szyk has this stylistic quality? It has so many flavors to it.
Okay, so let me just simply say that he was as fluent with Persian miniatures as he was with Renaissance art, as he was with Art Nouveau and German Expressionism, and he combined all of them. Let me just simply say that he combined all of them into his unique style. And so when the listeners see Arthur Szyk's art, you're never going to confuse him with any other artist, because he developed his Szykian style, if I may. And I believe that many viewers prior to this lecture may never have heard of Szyk, and it may be because art historians didn't know what to do with him and didn't write about him, because he wasn't influenced by any school, and there was no school of Szyk, so he was on his own and no one tackled it. So his style is unique, and it's hard to characterize it. You can't just simply say one over the other. It blended together.
Let's see if you'll meet me halfway. Here's a meeting of the minds, all right? I'll try to describe it, because not only did I admire the lecture today and earlier with the students in our art history class, but I'm trying to characterize this. The perfect, that Arthur Szyk's work is the perfect synthesis. It's a Sumerian modern, House of Windsor, Assyrio-Babylonian art deco.
Good. I put all those into the mix. Absolutely. Put them into the mix. He knew them all. He had books. He had Owen Jones.
And more. On Art Nouveau and Renaissance. The curls are from the Raffaellesco pattern that were taken from the Groteschi in the grottos of Pompeii in Herculaneum. And he took those, and the craftsmen up in Umbria, in a place called Deruta, make Robert Lehman, the great collector at the Metropolitan Museum and Met trustee, collected 2,000 of those ceramic plates with all those curls and decorative marginalia. Perfect. He was a Renaissance master also. Yes. Also.
Okay, good. Next question.
Brilliant.
Let me just jump in. The questions are mounting up, but before we turn to the questions from the audience, I know you shared some of this with Philip's class this morning, but I know that people would want to know how you first became interested in Szyk, acquired his art, sold his art, and how have you taken this from an interest of yours to a passion?
So this is a long story. I'm trying to make it real fast.
Short version.
When I first saw his art, when I needed gifts for people in my wedding party, I bought reproduction copies of his Haggadah. Then I was a rabbi for 13 years. I didn't think about Arthur Szyk. And as I like to tell people, as a rabbi, I didn't really have time to think. But that was that period. I then went into the antiquarian book world. I was in an antique shop I became a buyer and seller of rare books and documents. I went into an antique shop in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my wife is from. I kicked a box underneath the table. As it happened, I pulled up the box. It had colors that jumped out at me. Those were the same brilliant colors of religious art that I had seen 13 years earlier in the Haggadah. That was Arthur Szyk. And then as I exhibited book fairs, I saw books that he illustrated of Nazi art. Quickly understanding was anti-Nazi art. I loved the idea that this was an art who was combining art and politics, that he had a message to deliver. The more I told people about this artist, the more I got excited about it, the more people disappointed me with not knowing who this artist was. And I made a decision that this was something that I needed to tell everybody about. It turns out, it's a long story, but to speak fast and turn go ahead, his archives became available. They were owned by somebody else who bought them for the family, from the daughter. I had needed to own those archives. That man wanted several $100,000 for them. I couldn't afford it. That, you know, a few $1,000s in the bank, perhaps. And at the time, I thought, you know, in the 1990s, the Szyk needed to be more well-known. And the way to do that was to find a museum world that would exhibit his art. I called a friend of mine in Chicago, Rabbi Sherwin. Byron, how are you? Fine, Irv. Byron, have you ever heard of Arthur Szyk? Byron was the head of the Spertus Museum. Yes, Irv, I know who Arthur Szyk is. Byron, what about an exhibit in Chicago? Byron said, Irv, it's too cold in Chicago. You don't want to have an exhibit here. I called him 3 months later. Byron, how is your son Jason doing? He's fine, Irv. How's his sports, Byron? Great, Irv. Byron, what do you think about a Szyk exhibit in Chicago? Irv, that's a great idea, but not now. 3 months later, Byron called me back. Irv, what do you think about a Szyk exhibit in Chicago? Byron, that's a great idea. Let's do it. And that night I woke up in the middle of the night. I said, I have to own these archives that were owned by George Gooch in Southern California. I woke up in a sweat. I had friends. One particular friend whose head I banged against the wall to work with the Irv, stop, get off the pot. If you want it, buy it. I decided I needed to buy this. And I said to my wife that morning, Marge, we need to take out a second mortgage on our house. We must. I have to buy this archive. And I went to my dad, who had a $150,000 home. Dad, lend me a third of the value of that house, $50,000. I need to put it towards this. And I went to the man who was selling it, and I bought all the archives and basically made this commitment that I wanted to make this once famous artist in the world. And by the way, he was very famous. And I mean famous in Poland, in France, in Canada, in England, in the United States during his lifetime, but almost totally forgotten after he died in 1951. And I decided, you know, I'm going to give it my best shot, and decided to continue to buy his art, to sell his art, to develop clientele, and to write and publish, blah, blah, blah. It's a long story. I try to make it short.
Philip, I want to thank you for being with us. Maybe we can bring you back on towards the end of the evening. I want to open the floor up to all of these many questions. I'm going to get through as many of them as I can. All right, I'm going to start with one that we got actually early on in the lecture. A woman writes, my father had a copy of the Szyk Haggadah. As a child, I always found the illustrations very sad. Can you say something about the dark or sad expressions of the characters in the Haggadah? My parents, she writes, were Holocaust survivors, and somehow I always connected this Haggadah with my parents' world that was hidden from me.
Yes, there are faces that look sad, and there are faces that look determined, and there are faces that look frightened, and there are faces that look caricaturish of some Jews. But his Haggadah was a Haggadah that included religious Jews and secular Jews, men and women. This was a Haggadah that was for the Jewish people, and it was not a happy time in which he was creating this Haggadah. So some of the faces, some of the blank stares might be disturbing because these are not happy people. But these are real people, and this is how Szyk saw them, and it was that period in time, an unhappy time, that he wanted to bring to the world at that time, and also obviously to remind us that those unhappy times, which are filled with oppression and racism and bigotry and destructive forces, are going to be with us forever. As long as the world exists, there's good and there's evil, and one has to use the Haggadah text and its narrative of each and every generation. There are those who rise up to be prepared. And so these faces are not ideal as we might want them. You know, he also illustrated, by the way, Andersen's fairy tales, and that's pretty gruesome. By the way, his illustrated Andersen's fairy tales is in 1945 was published, was the most illustrated of any Andersen's fairy tales. I throw that in because people have told me as adults they were frightened to death by Szyk's images as children, but the stories are not particularly, you know.
Two questions here about George VI. David Levine writes, is there any record of George VI's reaction to the dedication of the Haggadah to himself? Excellent. Or evidence that it had any impact on Britain's policy towards Jewish aspirations in Palestine? And then Sherry Stahl asks, did the king understand Szyk's message?
Great question. I had in my possession a copy of the letter that King George wrote to the publishers of the Szyk Haggadah, which was obviously shared with Szyk. And in that letter, after receiving, actually the letter was written by, I guess, one of the secretaries to the king. I'm not sure what the position was, but it was written on behalf of the king, written to the publisher of the Haggadah and to Szyk, in which it says, the king is thrilled with this Haggadah, and that for a fortnight, for 2 weeks, he kept it with him in Windsor Castle, and everyone who came by, the king would show it to everyone. But whether the king understood what Szyk was saying in the dedication page, we don't know. So we don't know what kind of impact. I must say, the time that Szyk spent in London from 1937 to 1940 was a very difficult time for him, as it was for immigrants, Jewish immigrants everywhere. I mean, Szyk had to prove that he could employ people through the Beaconsfield Press on his project in order to stay there. It was not easy for a Jew to stay in Poland, even though he'd been to England in 33, 34. He had connections there. It was the same thing after he left. I'm using this to tell you something else. In 1940, when he left England, he didn't come directly to America, even though he had been here. He went to Canada, where the Polish consul in Canada welcomed him. And you know how hard it was for Jews to get into Canada, which was as hard, if not more difficult than it was to get into the United States. But that's another conversation.
Okay, one woman writes, I ordered and got the Szyk Haggadah, I'm assuming, just a few days ago, the paperback. The artwork is beautiful, needs to be seen to do it justice. She'd like to get more and wants to know if there's a way to get them perhaps in a pack rather than buying one by one. And then also asks, is there a version of this Haggadah with some English?
Yeah, the answer is that the Haggadah that Abrams published in 2011 has a complete English translation, the best English translation I've ever seen in a Haggadah, not because I published it, well, maybe because I published it and created the Haggadah, but Rabbi Sherwin's translation and commentary is the best I have ever seen in a Haggadah. I once published a book about Haggadot because I own 1,500 different ones, and I looked through every translation. It's the Haggadah translation from the 2008 luxury edition, which I published, and then appears in that popular trade edition 2011. And you don't have to call me or email me. You can go and buy it on Amazon. I think it's $18 or less. Fabulous English translation. The Hebrew text is a traditional Hebrew text that a Jew would have used in Poland in the early 20th century. But in the commentary section, we've added all the contemporary prayers and blessings that one might want to recite that have evolved since the 1940s. So I recommend the Abrams edition of the Szyk Haggadah, the paperback. By the way, if you decide you want to buy an $8,800 Haggadah or an $18,000 Szyk Haggadah, then you can get in touch with me.
Okay, Sue Kazari wants to know, what is your comment or opinion of the Moss Haggadah, which also has pages that recall the hatred of Jews by the Nazis?
David Moss is one of the most creative Jewish artists of our day. I know David personally. I've seen a ton of his books. I've been to Israel to visit him. I've been in his studio. I have nothing but respect for him. This is a man who lives his life by Jewish values and articulates it through his art. And I have a personal story with David and the Haggadah. Perhaps I could tell it now. It took in 1918. My first. This is a talk that's interesting to me. I don't know. I hope if you'll stay with me, those who are here, it's an interesting story. It has to do with David Moss, but it goes beyond David. Ellen, with a poetic license, I want to use this time to tell the story. My first talk I ever gave about Arthur Szyk was in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. And I was in the middle of that presentation. And I said, Szyk was born on June 3rd, 1894. And in the middle of that presentation, it turns out that that very day was June 3rd, 1994. It was 100 years to the day I was giving my first talk about Szyk on the 100th anniversary of his birthday. And I didn't realize it as I was preparing the talk. After my presentation, David Moss walked up to me, and David said to me, Irv, have you ever seen the original art, the original paintings of the Haggadah? This was 1994, and I never had. He said to me, Irv, had you ever thought about reproducing a new edition of that Haggadah? I said, David, no, I never have. I filed that away from what David had told me for 10 years later. And I went to the person who I knew owned all the original paintings of the Haggadah. At that point, I had seen the original art because I had curated a two exhibitions in which the original art was loaned by this gentleman from Chicago. And I said to him, would it be possible that, what are you going to do with your Haggadah? Are you going to give it to your children? And he said, no. I said, well, I would like to represent you as your agent and potentially sell this on your behalf, with the idea that I could also use the artwork to make digital images to create a new Haggadah. Anyhow, this attorney who owned the Haggadah said to me, Irv, why don't we do this? Let's work on a contract between you and me to represent. What's it worth? I said, well, by the way, I think it's worth a lot of money. And I told him what I thought it was worth. I went back home and I looked up, I knew where he had gotten the Haggadah. He had bought the Haggadah at Sotheby's in 1982. And do you know what he bought it in 1982? He bought it on June 3rd, on Szyk's birthday. That to me was fascinating. I signed a contract with him, and that I showed some people the Haggadah, and I needed to renew the contract with him. I went back, looked at the date, and it turns out that we had signed the contract for me to represent him on June 3rd. And then I sold the Haggadah to my very best clients in California. And I said to Paul and Sherry, have you seen the Haggadah yet? Have you showed it to your kids? Because the only thing they like better in the world than the Szyk's Haggadah were their children, and they loved. And then they loved the Haggadah. I called Paul. He hadn't showed it to him. Finally, I called him. Yes, Irv, this past Saturday, I showed our whole family the Haggadah. We got them all together. I said, Paul, do you know what last Saturday was? He said, no. I said, that was June 3rd, Szyk's birthday. David Moss was influential, a long way of using David Moss to tell you my story, but that was from the beginning. And I can't tell you whether there's a mystical element for you in this. There is for me a bit. June 3rd, June 3rd, June 3rd. I know on Wikipedia it says, there's a Wikipedia page, June 16th. That's because there's a Russian date, an American date, but Szyk on his documents wrote June 3rd. But to get a date changed, it's a problem. June 3rd.
All right, another question. Susan Cutler asks, can you please address why there are very few depictions of women in the Szyk Haggadah?
Well, the answer is there are few depictions of women, but there are pictures of numerous women in the Haggadah. And the heroic Judith at the very end on the French dedication page, Judith with the head of Holofernes is often associated with Hanukkah, on the top of Hanukkah lamps. But here, Szyk's original, he puts her in the Haggadah. But you'll see women who are going off to the land of Israel, young women, you'll see elderly women. Judith was a fighter. So that's not why I put her into the category of those warrior fighter heroes. But Szyk illustrated twice. Purim is coming. He illustrated twice the book of Esther. He illustrated the book of Ruth. So there are numerous women in the political World War II art of the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto. He has women fighters. So women are an integral part of his artwork, but there are more men than there are women in his Haggadah.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed in senior presentation that women really start to appear in the Haggadah in greater numbers once in terms of Zionism, which is not surprising, but he does include it. And I wanted to know also, I mean, I noticed the illustration of Judith and Holofernes. Who is Holofernes based, in Szyk's illustration?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Who's
the face?
Yes, who's the face, exactly.
Well, I don't know who the face is, but the face of Judith is his wife, the Szyk's wife. And she was known to be a real beauty. She was stunning. All the newspaper clippings that I've read, interviews, people just say the beautiful Julia Szyk, who was taller than him. You can see pictures that she's tall. He was a short man, but we don't know who the grandmother, the figures are in the Haggadah. I talk to the daughter quite often, Szyk's daughter, whom I knew for over 25 years. And we used to regularly talk about her father and Alexandra thought his Dybbuk was in me. And I used to say, no, Alexandra, it's not. But we used to talk about all these figures and who they are. But no, we don't know who they are.
Jeffrey Rudolph wants to know, he wrote, he has a copy of the Haggadah with the silver cover, yes, but doesn't see a copyright date. How does he know what edition it is?
It's hard to know. They did silver plated, not really even silver plated. It was certain metals that were in it. And they did them in numerous years. They did them at different covers, different silver covers in a small octavo or a quarto size, a little bit larger. Many of those are from either the 60s or the 80s. But it's hard to date them if they don't have the date on. but they were being reprinted regularly. Just to think, as I mentioned, 1956, the first printing of a book, 10,000 copies. That's a lot of copies of the first printing of a book in 56, and then 10,000 more in 57. But most of the Haggadahs that people see from the 1950s, 60s, and on up had this blue velvet cover, and they were with Hebrew and English, or sometimes just Hebrew text.
A few people asked about the rays coming out of Moses's head,
Right.
or horns, and
Right.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, he had a conversation with Michelangelo, and he decided that day he should go with Michelangelo's Moses and put them in. But the Hebrew Bible clearly states that these are carne, or not horns of light, but rays of light. And I like to think that Szyk saw these elements coming from Moses' head as the rays of light that were beaming forth from his head.
Now, one person asked, why did Szyk settle in the United States and not Israel?
That's a good question. In 1914, he went to Palestine for the first time and only time with a group of writers and artists from Poland. He spent about 6 months there. There is an anecdote that says that, or a legend that, I don't know if it's legend, not really, but that he taught at the Bezalel school. Certainly he would have known who they were. Everyone knew who Szyk was. I mean, wherever he lived, everyone knew who, everyone attended his exhibitions. I say that Woody Allen would have benefited in the Midnight in Paris if he put Szyk in his movie, because he was in all the cafes in Paris in the 20s. Everyone knew him. So, Szyk was well known. He was seen, and I forgot the question, but he was viewed and known by everyone.
Another question. Szyk was a Polish patriot, and
Yes.
yet the experience of the Jews in Poland was at best mixed. Why
Yes.
was Szyk ready to overlook the Jews' difficult history in Poland, whereas in other contexts, he was a fierce opponent of anti-Semitism?
No, he didn't overlook what was going on in Poland. Szyk was well aware of what was taking place in Poland. But Szyk, he was not from the shtetl. He was not, he was an upper middle class, from an upper middle class textile manufacturing family in Lodz. Szyk associated with Polish Catholics and German Protestants and Russian Orthodox, and the people knew him among the government officials. So he was well known and well respected as a Jew. After Poland, after World War I, and Poland went to war with the Soviet Union, Szyk was appointed as the director of art propaganda for Poland in its war with the Soviet Union. A Jew, the head of Polish propaganda. I mean, he loved Poland. He was a nationalist. He was good friends with the poet Julian Tuwim, who was well recognized in Poland even to this day. More remembered than Szyk, of course. But Szyk was well known. He was and respected by the Poles. And in fact, a very little known fact, which is really worth saying, I think, one of the bodies of work that were exhibited at the Library of Congress that I showed next to Washington in his times was this body of work of statutes of Kalisz, the laws of the Polish town of Kalisz from the 13th century. Szyk illuminated that in the 20th century because he wanted the Polish government and other governments of Europe to empower their minorities, because that's how the governments succeed. And so he did this portfolio with the idea that it should show the mutual and beneficial cooperation between Jews and Poles throughout the centuries. And do you know what that Polish government did in 1932, the year before Hitler came to power? That Polish government took Arthur Szyk's artwork and exhibited in 14 cities throughout Poland because they respected Szyk. And this group of people respected Jews. Not everyone who was Polish hated Jew, and not every Jew had an attitude towards Poles, but Szyk was a bridge. You have a bridge between nations and peoples. And I think I said that a few times in my talk, and when I say it, I get excited because that's how his art was used. His art of Washington in his times, conversely, that I showed, was bought by the president of Poland and given as a gift to Franklin Roosevelt to create, on the eve of World War II, closer relations between Poland and the United States. And it was Szyk's art that was used. And that body of work was hung in Roosevelt's White House. And when Roosevelt gave his famous For Freedom speech in January of 1941, 38 paintings on freedom were in Roosevelt's White House. So that is how Szyk's art was used with regard to freedom. To get back to the Poland issue, Szyk was well aware of anti-Semitism, well aware, and made comments about how he saw some Poles after the war was over, but he loved the nationalist feeling of Poland. He loved three countries, as I mentioned. Poland was a homeland, a land of his birth, but Israel was the land of his people. But he also saw the Poles as his people also, and he writes that in some of his illuminated texts.
Thanks. We're almost out of time. I just want to quickly get in a few more questions, and then I'll ask Dr. Lysoff if he'd like to rejoin us and ask a question. And if I have time, I'll ask a question. If not, we'll just have to close the evening out. Marcy Schoenfeld writes, if only 2 of the dedications were in the original version, where did you find them?
Actually, there were a total of 5. 2 were in the Haggadah, the King George, and the French dedication page. The ones to Germany and Austria, and the ones to Germany, and the one with the Yiddish and Polish text. I found the 2 to Germany and Austria. They were owned by private people who had them. I'm trying to think who I know. I remember purchasing one. I remember the second person, I'm not sure, but they were bought from individuals. In fact, one of them was part of Szyk's illustrated second book of Esther. He illustrated Book of Esther in 1925 and a totally different Book of Esther in 1950. And one of the dedication pages of the Haggadah was mixed in with the Book of Esther. And when I handled the brokering of that image was in there, and I asked the purchaser if he wouldn't mind my purchasing that one page. The Haggadah, so that was where one came from, not sure the other. We do not know where the original art is for the dedication page to the Jews of Lvov, of Lemberg. But I found a reproduction of it in one Haggadah and was able to make the dedication page.
Thanks. In the beginning of the presentation, you showed a portrait of George Washington by Arthur Szyk. What made him create this piece, and why did he feel a connection to the US even before he moved here?
Szyk's first illustrations and symbols of America were in 1927 when he illustrated the Statutes of Kalish. By the way, I had once owned his diary from 1927. It's in beautiful Russian text. And he said, this work will be the work of my life. Not, he did say that, but he said that about other works as well. But it was in 1927 that he also said, this is the year I will become the master. And in 1927, when he illuminated the statutes, one of the pages had American flags on it in 1927, because Szyk saw America as the land of his ideals, where he felt that he could be free to express everything that he wanted. Whereas in Europe and in England still, he had felt he needed to get to America. He got to America because the Polish government in exile that moved to London and was there in 1939, and the British government, both governments decided to sponsor Szyk's coming to America to bring the face of the war in Europe to the Western world. And that's why that's how he came to America, through their sponsorship. And then he went on, as I mentioned, to become the leading anti-Nazi artist here. But Szyk created his first symbols, and then he did all these paintings of George Washington, American Revolution, even before he visited here for the first time. There was a congressman here named Saul Bloom who knew Szyk in Europe. He would send him some materials, and Szyk would find books, and he would learn the whole history of the American Revolution before he came here. And in fact, in one of the images of the Battle of Concord, one of the first battles of the American Revolution, Szyk paints a black man in the front of that portrait in 1930. In 1930, when he's creating the original art, 1930 in Paris, when he paints this image, remember this portfolio was bought in 35, but he creates the original artwork in 1930, and there's a black man in the very front. Szyk illuminating the black man at a time for fighting for freedom, at a time when the black man isn't free. And that is Szyk from 1930 on, and so his ideals and attachment to America evolved there as well.
Thank you. There are so many more fabulous questions. We just don't have time to get to them. Someone did ask, how can he see this broadcast again? By the end of next week, you should be able to access this lecture by just typing in Bennett Center, Fairfield University, or Bennett Center. I think the best way is Bennett Center, Fairfield University. That'll take you to our website, and then just click where it says lectures. And then you should actually, it should be right there. If not, you'll click on something like previously recorded lectures. Any problems in accessing this talk, just write to the Bennett Center or to Jennifer Haynos, who is our program manager at jhaynos, Haynos, at fairfield.edu, or you can write to me, eumansky at fairfield.edu. Philip, one quick, short, last question.
In your work, in this comprehensive biography of Szyk, we have clearly understood from your lecture and the quality of the images that he was a great artist. That is beyond debate. He is a great artist. But Irvin, do you find that let's call it the glass ceiling, is that because he's in a league with when he arrives and starts working for Collier's and he starts printing, he's competing with Maxfield Parrish and Norman Rockwell and even N.C. Wyeth as a great American illustrator, but his work is always about its Jewish content for the most part, so that it's difficult for you to help us, or as in your work, see him as the great artist he should be. Okay. What do you see as the limitation of the that he was part of the great age of illustrators?
Yeah, I would say that there is no limitation for Arthur Szyk. With the internet now, and with the publications and museum exhibitions and the lectures and the talks that are going on, this man will rise to the top. This cream will rise to the top. You know, I'm happily, other people are starting to give talks about Arthur Szyk. And Donald Cuspit, one of the great art historians of our time, wrote in Art Forum magazine back in 2017, when we look at the artists of the 1940s, of Ben Sham, of Ben Sham and Hopper and Jackson Pollock, probably the greatest artist of them all, Donald Cuspit, right, is an artist you probably never heard of, and his name is Arthur Szyk. That in Art Forum by Donald Cuspit. Szyk is rising to the top. And believe me, this is one aspect of his art that I talked about today, his magnum opus, his Haggadah, his Jewish work of art. But if I come back 2 years from now, or I have my second coming in any place, you'll hear about his universalism. You'll see his humanity. You'll see why he was an artist for the people. You'll see why his art that deals with racism and Blacks and Native Americans that he illustrated in 1945 will rise to the top. There is no keeping this man down. The only thing is people to become aware of him. And people don't know that they're waiting to know about Arthur Szyk, but they'll know. And if I had one final word to say before Ellen says her final word, and I can't tell you how many times I said this is the final slide or my final word, but this is that I first was drawn to Szyk because of the colors. That's what attracted me. The colors jumped out at me. Quickly, I realized after that, there were the messages in his art. Szyk used to say, art is not my aim, it's my means. And I was drawn to the messages, and the messages began to overwhelm the art, began to focus on that. But then I came back to the art, and I realized the genius of the art with the messages. And then one more thing I realized, that behind the great art and behind the great messages stands Arthur Szyk, the great man.
Thank you so much, Irvin, for being with us. This was just a wonderful evening. I want to thank all of you out there, people in the audience, for staying with us, for all of your wonderful questions. I do wish we had more time for Irvin to address them, but I guess we're going to have to come to a close. Irvin Ungar, really, thank you for bringing Arthur Szyk and his work to life this evening. Thank you really for your scholarship, your passion. And really, I really do think that you really have brought Arthur Szyk to the world once again. And thank you so much. And to Larry Roberts, Suzanne Novick, thank you. I know your parents would have loved to have been at this lecture this evening. A wonderful way to honor their memory. Everybody, no one has to drive home. So usually I say, have a good trip home. I guess we can all just close our computers. And again, thank you all for being with us.